What's going on, politicians? We're back again with another celebration of learning. I'm Ian.
I'm Kenneth.
I'm Karthik.
And I'm Ryan.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the United States v. Lopez case in which federalism is demonstrated. So imagine this. You're a high school student who decided to sell guns in school, and then you get sued by the whole government. What would you do? We're going to be covering that in today's presentation. So, on March 10th, 1992, on a very normal day in San Antonio, Texas, a high school student, Alfonso Lopez Jr., brought a gun to class with the intention of selling it and 5 additional cartridges of ammunition to a fellow student. You know, like we all do. As you'd probably expect, school authorities caught wind of this, and he was charged under a state law that banned the possession of guns in school. The charges were dropped, but he was charged again, now under a federal law, the Gun-Free School Zones Act. The trial moved all the way up to the Supreme Court, where he eventually had the federal charges dropped as well. Leading up to this case, there was a trend towards increasing the power of the federal government. The Supreme Court's decision in McCulloch, Gibbons, and Social Security demonstrate this expansion of national power and the Supreme Court's tendency to support Congress in matters of implied powers. However, the result of this case reversed that, as it protected some of the state rights that had been decreasing in the prior years. The main argument of this was about the interpretation of the Commerce Clause from the Constitution. As one of the enumerated powers, Congress is allowed to regulate activity related to commerce between the states. As you can see, commerce is a little bit ambiguous, and that's where the conflict in this case arises. The federal government used this clause to defend the prosecution of Lopez, as they argued that education was an economical matter, so it was within their power to enforce their Gun-Free School Zones Act on the student. Many see a problem with this argument, viewing it as an abuse of Congress's power, overstepping states' rights. Can you blame them though? They just wanted the bag.
So what is the Gun-Free School Zones Act, you may ask? Basically, it amends the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ECEA, to require local educational agencies, LEAs, as a condition of receiving ECEA assistance from the state to have in effect a policy requiring expulsion from school for at least one year of any school student who has brought a gun, knife, or other weapon to school under LEA jurisdiction. In 1994, Congress introduced the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994, which encouraged each state receiving federal funds for education to follow suit and introduce their own laws, now known as zero-tolerance laws. President Bill Clinton signed the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994 into law on March 31st, 1994. The image on the bottom left is an example of a school zone that has the Gun-Free School Zone Act sign on the school grounds. This court case preserves the system of federalism, which delegates certain powers to states and certain powers to the federal government. This upholds the principles that states have control of local issues, like gun possession on school grounds. Federalism is a mixed or compound mode of government that combines a general government with regional governments in a single political system, kind of like how most colleges obtain general information through the Common App, which is like a federal government, while each college has their own questions that may be specific to their own school. This is similar to how the federal government sets a minimum wage, and the states may increase that minimum wage in their own state if they would like. The minimum wage, for example, in California is $13 US, while the minimum wage in Texas is $7.25 US, which also happens to be the federal minimum wage.
Lopez still wanted to try to dismiss the federal charges under the Gun-Free School Zones Act by claiming that public schools were outside of the jurisdiction of the federal government. Unfortunately, the trial court denied this argument, claiming that because all schools influence the U.S.'s economy as well as interstate commerce, the federal government has jurisdiction over public schools through the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause. The diagram on the bottom right illustrates the different ways schools impact the US as a whole, as well as the economy. Continuing the fight, Lopez took the case to the US Court of Appeal for the Fifth Circuit. He argued that Congress was overstepping their constitutional powers described in the Commerce Clause by passing the act. The Fifth Circuit Court, shown in the top right, agreed with Lopez's argument and reversed the conviction. However, the bloodthirsty US government decides that this poor teenager is not off the hook yet and appeals the case, bringing it to the Supreme Court, who agreed to hear it. At this point, the US government had the burden to prove that the act was substantially relating to interstate commerce and thus isn't unconstitutional.
The Supreme Court is now tasked with determining whether the Gun-Free School Zones Act is constitutional, judging not only some random teenager, but the actions of the government as a whole. The Supreme Court is split 5-4, with the majority siding with the decision of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The view of the majority, led by Chief Justice Rehnquist in the picture on the left, was that if the Supreme Court decided that the Gun-Free School Zones Act were constitutional under the Commerce Clause, then that would open the door to the government restricting basically any human activity, as it could be argued that most human activities are ultimately a part of the national economy. As you can see in the picture on the right, Associate Justice Breyer was not very happy with the decision and wrote a dissent, claiming that the presence of gun violence in or near schools had an undeniable and widespread impact on the quality of education itself, and therefore impacted the whole nation significantly enough to the point where the federal government could intervene. Due to the majority's decision, a new precedent was set to limit national power and allow states more power to decide how to enforce laws, a measure justified by the 10th Amendment. For example, in the Prince versus United States case that followed, the court used the 10th Amendment to claim that the federal government could not require the local law enforcement to perform background checks for handgun purchases. So, what do you think? Do you agree with the majority or the minority decision? Let us know in the comments section down below. Leave a like, subscribe, make sure to click the bell, support our Patreon, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, follow us on Google+,